You all for joining us on this beautiful March evening. My name is Michael Denhammer, and I'll be your host and moderator for tonight's conversation. On our event, Radical Imagination, Storytelling, and Ways of Connection. Before I begin, I want to start by acknowledging the territories that I'm coming to you today from, which is the lands of the unceded Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. These nations continue to affirm their sovereignty and jurisdiction over these lands, and it is through this sovereignty and jurisdiction that we must support these nations in their assertion of self-determination to control and manage their ancestral waters, lands, and territories. In the words of one of tonight's speakers, Gaye Teresa Johnson, freedom seekers remind us that we do not struggle to create meaningful futures out of nothing. The historical groundwork has been laid over decades of shared alliances and identities. This too applies to our work in supporting these nations by affirming their sovereignty over these lands and learning from the deep history of Indigenous resistance and solidarity movements on these lands. So this event is hosted by the Center for Community Engaged Learning, and we're focused on bringing community organizations with their diversity of backgrounds and lived experiences together with faculty and students to approach complex societal challenges. We do this by working collaboratively with campus and community partners on programs and initiatives both on and off campus. We remain committed to serving our faculty, community partners, and students. And at this time, our team is focused on its efforts towards online engagement to ensure continued transformative learning and programming for students, community, and to be ready when the time calls from community and faculty to find new ways to work together on societal issues that were previously unknown or unexpected. These efforts are undertaken by the perspective that the university as a public citizen plays a critical role in supporting our students, faculty, and community partners to weather this immediate crisis. We are committed to strengthening the resilience and recovery of the community, the sectors that comprise it, and to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable society. Sorry about that. The Doing Stories Justice speaker series highlights the efforts of individuals, communities, and organizations. Their work recognizes our interdependence and builds power into our communities. Their stories are used to enlighten us, to engender empathy, to connect across difference, and to catalyze social change. The event series focused on 4 themes: stories of community safety, stories of a just transition, hidden histories, and here we are at the final event, Radical Imagination. Each event brought together community members, advocates, and theorists to discuss how they use stories in their work. We've learned about the relational nature of storytelling and listening and how to bring reciprocity, responsiveness, and intimacy into our work and how we as listeners do stories justice. The theme for our final event series is Radical Imagination, Storytelling, and Ways of Connection. We'll learn about how imagination is grounded in our collective and diverse histories, and in Max Haiven's words, imagination is something we do together. We'll discuss how social movements experiment with, invoke, and enact imaginative futures today. And we'll learn about the Black radical tradition, its grounding in anti-colonial and liberation movements, and importance of this tradition in our present moment. Throughout the next 90 minutes, I encourage you to share your thoughts and resources into the chat. We'll compile a list of resources and readings and send them out after the event. Additionally, we'll have plenty of time for audience Q&A. Please head to sli.do and type in #Cecil and feel free to ask any questions as well as upvote any questions there. Lastly, we'll also be live tweeting the event, and you can join the conversation on Twitter and follow us at UBCCCEL. Okay, let's begin. So we'll start with a short conversation with Max Haiven, followed by a short conversation with Gaye Teresa Johnson, and then we'll bring them both together for a collective conversation, followed by plenty of time for questions from you. So I'll introduce Max now. Max Haiven is the Canada Research Chair in Culture, Media, and Social Justice at Lakehead University, located on the Anishinaabe lands of the North Shore of the Gichigami under the Robinson Superior Treaty, which is now known as Thunder Bay, Canada. He's the co-director of Reimagining Value Action Lab, Rival. And his most recent books are Art After Money, Money After Art, Creative Strategies Against Financialization, Revenge Capitalism, The Ghost of Empire, Demons of Capital, and the Settling of Unpayable Debts, which was just released late last year. So congrats, Max, for that. And also Radical Imagination, which he was the co-author of in 2014, released by Fernwood Publishing. Max also edits Vagabonds, which is a series of short radical books from Pluto Press. Max, as he says on his Twitter, is 2 letters shy of a tax haven and is full of the milk of human kindness. So Max, welcome. We're so happy to have you here tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
I blurted out laughing when I read that in your most recent book.
Yeah, I think the terrible secret of that is that it's uttered by Lady Macbeth about her husband in that play, and it doesn't bode well for either of them. So I'm not sure I should have necessarily written it about myself.
I didn't catch that reference, but that is there's a lot of irony in that for sure. Okay, so let's dive right into it. You've written so many books, and there's so much there, and we'll just be talking about a few of them tonight. But I do hope you can bring in like the breadth of your knowledge and experience over the years as well. So the first question I have, in your book, Radical Imagination, you speak about imagination as this collective process. And as I mentioned already, you say imagination is something we do together. Can you share about how you see imagination as this collective process and how you see this as a necessary aspect of solidarity?
Yeah. I suppose I begin from the position, which is a fairly banal one that we probably all acknowledge, which is that we humans, whatever else we are a cooperative species, that we have to cooperate to survive and especially to thrive together in our world. We cooperate to care for one another. We require a huge amount of care as infants, and throughout our whole life, we require the care of others. And care is cooperative. It's a way of working together for a greater good. We also cooperate, of course, to build things together, to build our tools, to build our shelter, to grow our food. We cooperate in order to make great works of the imagination in terms of those great artworks that inspire us. But I think as much as we're cooperative, we are also have this strange thing that we call the imagination as well, which is this capacity to use our brains to think about things that are not there. And not only to use our brains, but to use our whole bodies to think about what is not there. And this we do on an everyday basis when we imagine people who aren't around, or spaces that we might go in the city or in the world that we have not yet been, or that we are not there at the moment. It also allows us to project ourselves into the future, and it allows us to imagine what it might have been like to live in the past. And perhaps most importantly, the imagination is the core to how we are able to empathize with others, to imagine what it might be like to be someone else. And so for all of these reasons, it's very important to value the imagination, not just as a kind of mental living room where you kind of go into your head to imagine how nice it would be to win the lottery or whatever your dream is, but actually imagination is this collective process. And the imagination, as we have it, it draws on these narratives, these images, these artworks, these ideas that surround us, and we make them new. We take them in, and we reconfigure them and we communicate them with others to come up with new ideas and new narratives and new artworks. And so through this process, I've come to think about the imagination not as something as an individual has, but something that people do and they do together. Now that might sound really nice, but it also has really horrifying elements to it as well. I mean, today we live in a world of vast and growing inequalities, and those inequalities by and large are based on pretty much imaginary constructs. So we have the construct of money, for instance, which all of us know now is like an intangible digital asset sitting somewhere in some bank's databases. And based on this imaginary construct, we allow millions of people to thrive and billions of people to die or suffer in poverty. our world has been constructed by the artificially imagined categories of race that have informed colonialism and racism that brought us to the present moment where our world continues to be plagued by these vexations. So when we say the imagination is something that we share and something we do together, it's something we share and we do together for good and for ill. And so it becomes very important for, especially for those of us who are interested in humanities, those of us who are interested in creating artwork, literary work, works of criticism, and also social movements, to try and struggle to transform how we imagine the world. And as part of transforming how we imagine the world, transform how we cooperate in the world as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. And it brings Tony Cade Bambara together to my mind of making the revolution irresistible as well, and building that collective imagination together. Great. So building on that, another quote that you share in the same book, Radical Imagination, is the imagination is not some transcendental spirit, but an embodied presence. And, thinking about like just the origins of the word radical, you share that the radical imagination is not just about dreaming of different futures, but bringing those futures back to work in the present. So tangibly speaking, how do you see these social movements enacting these futures in the present?
I think that social movements of a whole variety are often animated by a question that they don't always ask explicitly, which is, what would it mean to win? What would it mean for our struggle to succeed? What would it mean to change the world? Often, I think the movements I've been part of and the movements I've studied over the years often find themselves so busy and so ground down by the everyday struggle against injustices that they don't have the time, or don't feel they have the time to really ask this question and dwell with it. And yet that question is always dwelling in our hearts in a certain way. And it's dwelling in the imagination we share together. So I think it's very important that movements in some way travel to the future together, and imagine what those futures could be. And then based on what those futures could be, bring back a critique of the present. I mean, just on a very simple level, we have the resources on this planet and the relationships and the ingenuity and the capacities to create an abundant life for all, not only all humans, but also other forms of life as well. That's a possibility that lies before us if we made other choices. And going to the future through artwork, through discussions, through collective movement, through social movements that try and sort of fight for that kind of future in the present, we can imagine that that kind of future is possible, and then judge the institutions and structures of our present against what is possible. And I think that's a very important thing we need to do, especially now, because it's so easy, especially in moments of crisis, to fall back on a notion that somehow the world we live in needs to be this way, that it's necessary. In fact, very little about our world is necessary. Things could change dramatically if we were to struggle for them. And I think the basis of struggles is that knowledge that we feel deep in our souls that things could be different. I just want to say a final note about that notion that the imagination is embodied, because I think it's really important. There was a school of thought, mostly coming out of like European white dude theory, that the imagination was some sort of shared experience, and it really isn't. I mean, as I mentioned a moment ago, and as others have noted as well, the imagination is something that's through our entire body. It's not just something that happens in the sort of gray matter of our brain. It's something that we experience in the world as we, as sort of sensing beings, make our way in the world. And that, I think, really importantly means that the imagination of people will be different depending on how their body is treated. So the experience of living under patriarchy, under a transphobic system, under racism, under colonialism, that impact on people's bodies transforms what they're able to imagine. And I think that is one of the reasons why in our moment, some of the most vital and precious insights into the kind of future we need to struggle for are coming from people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, trans people, and others who are suffering these forms of oppression, enduring these forms of oppression, and whose imaginations are necessarily been awakened to the complexities and entanglements of these forms of oppression, and what it would mean to dream of a future beyond them, which would be a better future for everyone.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, and something that I need to kind of sit with. But yeah, like really wonderful way to think of how imagination is enacted on our bodies as full things as well. Okay, so I'm gonna switch pace a little bit here, just so we can move on to some of the bigger questions later in the event. In Radical Imagination, you talk about Fred Moden and Stefano Harney, and Gaye actually talks about both of them a fair bit as well in their work. So they both speak about the enclosure of research, and how the academy kind of like encloses research and keeps it to themselves, and that's kind of like this natural process, and says what research is and what research isn't. So in rethinking research and rigorous inquiry, we can see how these are intimate parts of everyday life, especially as they're imagined and experienced in struggles against systemic power. So how do you see social movements engaged in both experimentation and research? And how can students interested in social movements support rather than extract and enclose knowledge?
Yeah, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's book, The Undercommons, which I want to give a shout out to their publisher, Two Minor Compositions, which has been really bringing out such brilliant work and making sure it's free online and available to everyone as well. And the editor there, Stephen Shukaitis, who's done that work really well, and also thinks very interesting ways about the imagination and art movements, especially. They give us such a wonderful set of conceptual tools for thinking through how this thing that so many of us yearn for when we come to the university, or we've been taught to yearn for when we come to this university, is in fact a stolen thing. The thing that we want, which is communion with one another, to be able to imagine together, to think outside the box, to learn about the world. That's stuff that humans have been doing forever. And it's stuff that that people who have not been granted access to the university have been doing in their communities for a very, very long time. And in our society, we've identified this strange medieval white supremacist institution of the university as the only legitimate space where that kind of rigorous thinking and problem solving and commonality and communing of knowledge takes place. But of course, that's a myth. And it's a myth that serves to reproduce the power and majesty of the university. Now, I've been a beneficiary of the university. I have a very nice job at one. I'm very happy in an individual sense about the university, but I feel in some way that, along with Moten and Harney, that we need to take an abolitionist view towards the university, just as we take an abolitionist view towards the police and to prisons, which is to ask the question, to what problem does the university present itself as the solution? And when did we learn that it was the only solution to that problem? And by what other mechanisms could we answer that question or that problem of how to provide ourselves with knowledge and education and what they call study? And what would we need to do now to create the institutions that will replace the university as we know it? And I think those are the basis of coming to a place where I think students and the rest of us who are more or less trapped in the university and more or less privileged within the university can maybe come to this question you ask about, like, how do you work in solidarity with social movements? Here in Thunder Bay, I work with two social movements. One of them is called Window de Buemosewen, which is a volunteer Indigenous-led street patrol that's halfway between a kind of cop watch organization and a direct action street patrol. And the other is called Not One More Death, which targets the institutional sources of premature death, mostly of Indigenous, but also racialized and poor people in the city. And the city is Canada's hotspot right now for racism, murder, opioid deaths, and other terrible sort of racist institutional crimes. And we have a lot of people who want to come work with us. And one of the things that we often ask them, and I think it's worth us all asking ourselves when we engage in this work, is how is our liberation bound up in the work that of the social movement we want to join? Because if you're coming to a social movement to work with them to get credit at the university, if you're coming to a social movement out of a sense of charity, if you're coming out of a sense that your fate is not bound up with the people you're working with, it's not worth it. I think it will be an extractive relationship on some level. And I think asking the question of how our fates are bound up together forces us to take a leap of the imagination and recognize the higher goals that we might share for not only ending particular institutional practices, but actually destroying systems of oppression and domination as well.
Great. Yeah, really wonderful and an important challenge for all the students in the room as well, to think about what that means for us as students in thinking through how do we change our approach with the university and the powers that create it today. So for the last two questions, I want to get to your most recent work, Revenge, and all it entails. It's a great way to think about a word that I don't necessarily, before reading your book, had ever really considered it as integral to capitalism itself. But after reading it now, I'm seeing these like random quotes from like Aimé Césaire or Nietzsche come up, and like you can reframe them through this lens of revenge quite simply, actually. So it's a wonderful way to think about capitalism. So I'll start with one of the quotes from this book, and then I'll proceed with a question. Under capitalism, a system driven by contradiction and competition rather than coherence and conspiracy, systemic revenge emerges without any single agent intending it. That's the tragedy, curse, and challenge of this moment. So we don't have much time to get into like the juicy details of your book, unfortunately, but I do want to pull a few things out. In what ways you see capitalism and revenge bound together, specifically around the themes of unpayable debts, surplus populations, and hyper-enclosure.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a big one. I'll try and go through it quickly, and apologies if it doesn't make sense. So on the first thing to say is that capitalism has always, as a system that is indelibly entangled with cis hetero patriarchy and colonialism and racism, has always relied on revenge. It's always relied on taking this brutal, heart-rending, violent action against people who oppose it. And not only against people who oppose it, but even just people who are oppressed by it in any case. It rots out the soul, as Aimé Césaire pointed out, it rots out the soul of the oppressor, and they become, in some sense, addicted to a kind of vengeful violence, to kind of take revenge for what they've lost. But on another level as well, so the first level is quite overt, that the system depends on vengeance of the powerful against those whom they oppress. On another level, though, I wanted to understand something that maybe some of you will recognize, which is that if you actually sit down with people who run horrible corporations that are doing terrible things around the world, most of them, if you buy them a drink or two, are not the kind of blood-soaked monster we might think of. They actually might be fairly nice, educated people who agree on the need for social justice. And so my question is, how is a system of domination maintained that is vengeful, but where no individual within that system needs to be vengeful? No one needs to really want horrible things to happen. And so my argument there, I draw on a long tradition of sort of Marxist thought to say, well, actually, maybe vengefulness is the outcome of the system, but not the intention of the system. Maybe everyone competing to survive within a system based on competition actually creates these forms of vengeance that don't necessarily need a single author. They just sort of emerge from the system naturally. So I name three in the book that I really focus on. One of them is the fact that we live in this world of unpayable debts. For instance, the debts that have been forced on many nations in the global south during the period of so-called post-colonialism or neo-colonialism. as Kwame Nkrumah taught us. These are debts that can never be repaid, and yet they continue to be enforced. And increasingly, these debts are loaded onto individuals as well, as many people here are experiencing going into student debt. And then we have this kind of revenge of surplusing of populations, this horrific way that capitalism takes people and makes them reliant on being participants in capitalism to buy the things they need to survive, and yet has no work for them. And so there's this competition to see which population will be made disposable so that the system can continue to produce massive profits for a tiny handful of people. And then something I mentioned is as hyper-enclosure, which is a broad term, but you can think about the way capitalism is now trying to dominate and enclose our life world, using data mining and data management techniques to harvest our attention, trying to claim even the language of social justice in order to sell products. All of these are forms I speak of capitalism's revenge. And then the final piece of the puzzle is that, like all systems of domination, and we can see this most clearly in the history of colonialism, but also in things like the history of patriarchy and the witch trials, capitalism then very cunningly turns the narrative around and says it isn't capitalism that's vengeful. It's the enemies of capitalism that are pathologically, nihilistically vengeful. It's those people who are rising up against the system, who are seeking revenge against the rich and the entitled and the hardworking. And so through labeling their opponents as the vengeful ones, it in fact legitimates or justifies the defenders of capitalism, the defenders of colonialism, the defenders of all these regimes, to take a kind of preemptive revenge against them, to say we need to contain and control those people so that they don't take revenge against us. It's a very dangerous state of affairs.
Yeah, incredible. And as I was reading through your book, also seeing the news of uprisings in Haiti and uprisings in Senegal as being intimately connected to this notion of unpayable debts. And reading through Gaye Teresa Johnson's work, a Ruth Wilson Gilmore essay talking about surplus populations within prisons to maintain the prison industrial complex, and seeing all these ideas that are on the forefront right now, really coming together around those three themes illustrated in your book. So in thinking through what you shared about, vengeance being enacted against individuals, and how individuals then kind of become blamed for being vengeful, you make an argument for a different kind of future, one not based out of revenge, but one based on like an avenging imaginary. And those two ideas are really closely tied. And to me, I guess what I thought of was avenging feels like this collective process inherently. But what's the difference? What do you see as the difference between revenging and avenging? And how does a politics based on avenging call for an abolition of capitalism?
Thank you. I have to admit that as I got to the end of the revenge book, I found myself really struggling because, as I think we were talking about at the beginning, I'm not a particularly vengeful or like violent person, not very good in a fight. Maybe some fights of ideas, but I don't know if that's exactly what we're doing. But I did come to this frustration, which is that when I told people I was writing a book on revenge, people got very, very angsty. In fact, I should be specific that white people got very angsty about it. And they tended to bring up the strange figures of Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela as what in the book I end up calling the prophets of forgiveness, with the double entendre being that they're both prophets seeing the future, but also prophets in terms of creating some sort of value out of it. And I think all three of these freedom fighters had incredibly complex lives. They chose paths of nonviolence for very specific tactical reasons that need to be studied. But in the kind of hagiography or saint making around their figures, especially within kind of mainstream media and commentary, all of that nuance and tactical and strategic thought gets thrown out the window in favor of this idea that we should all just forgive and forget and move on and not dwell on the past and move together into a bright future together. And I think we can see, for those of us who are based on the the territory is currently called Canada, this is also the agenda of the government, with its sort of reconciliation agenda with Indigenous people, that we should forgive and forget and move on towards the next phase where we're all going to enter into the 21st capitalist century together. And we've seen very heroically that Indigenous people across this nation and across Turtle Island and indeed around the world are rising up to say, no, in fact, we're not going to accept reconciliation within a system that is objectively destroying the earth and objectively continuing the policies of genocide that have been waged against us for all of these centuries. So in trying to refuse the politics of reconciliation, which I think has been mapped so well by UBC Prof. Glenn Coulthard in his book, Red Skin, White Masks, and also by Eve Tuck, from OISE at University of Toronto, also from nearby the territories where you are today. I sort of tried to draw out a different view, which wouldn't, of course, say we want a politics of revenge, because that can get very dark very quickly, but to say we want a politics of avenging. And what would that mean? For me, it's still a bit of a riddle. I came up with a few phrases based on reading work by Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, like, an avenging imaginary is the conviction that what you and what you love has value in a world that's rendered it worthless. Or the idea that a revenge fantasy is the idea of turning the tables, where you gain the power of those who oppressed you and you use it against your oppressors. But an avenging imaginary is the overturning of the tables. It's the idea, I suppose, that what you desire in your struggle is not to simply claim for your own the same weapon that hurt you, but to destroy that weapon, to make sure that nobody can be hurt in that way again. And I think that's something that I take very much from the work of Ruth Gilmore, from Angela Davis, and from many other great thinkers of the kind of abolitionist tradition, that, you know, the idea is not simply to put different people in prisons, you know, corporate criminals, let's say, who destroyed and despoiled the earth, or politicians who continue to pursue racist and colonial practices. The idea is to, in fact, abolish the structure of the prison completely and replace it with different systems of justice that prize the diversity of human experience, that prize care and transformation instead. But I admit that it's still a bit of a riddle to me. I'm still trying to understand what an avenging imaginary might mean. I think ultimately it will be determined not in the kind of theoretical realm, but in the realm of struggles themselves, as people in a way turn their rage, which they're right and justified to feel at what is being done to them and their communities in this world, and transmute that somehow into visions of a collective future of collective liberation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and it and in hearing you say that, I kind of think about a lot of these transformative justice practitioners in thinking through like what can exist beyond carceral notions of punishment and into a world of consequences but not punishments, and how that plays into this avenging imaginary as well. So you also spoke a little bit about justice, which we are going to get to together in a little bit. But at this point, Max, I want to thank you for what you shared, and we'll see you again in about 20 minutes after a quick conversation with Gaye. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so now I'll introduce Gaye Teresa Johnson. So Gaye writes and teaches on race and racism, cultural history, spatial politics, and political economy. Her first book, Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlement in Los Angeles, is a history of civil rights and spatial struggles among Black and Brown freedom seekers and cultural workers in LA. Gaye's current work includes an edited volume on the futures of Black radicalism, co-edited with Alex Lubin, and a single authored book currently, okay, this isn't up to date. I think it's got a new name called something Ring. Sorry, Gaye, what's your upcoming book called again?
I have a book that is done, that is under review at University of North Carolina Press, which is called Rings of Dissent, and it's about boxing and the performances of rebellion. That's co-edited with David J. Leonard and Rudy Mondragon. And then I have another book that is in progress that is a single author manuscript called These Walls Will Fall.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you for adding that information.
Sure.
So Gaye is also a researcher, storyteller, and freedom dreamer. Her proudest achievement is being a mother and part of a circle of family, friends, allies, accomplices that constitute the core of her life. Gaye, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so excited to have you. And, my brain is just sparking with all the connections between what Max was sharing and what we're about to talk about now as well. So let's jump right in.
Okay.
So, and I want to focus on, in your words, the spirit of abolition and the work of revolutionary change and the relentless critique of oppression. But I also want to acknowledge all of the young, early first year, second year students that are in the room today, to build a bit of a foundation together. Mm-hmm. So Cedric Robinson, who is, I guess, the inspiration between the book you edited, Black Radical Futures, he uses the term racial capitalism to articulate the lines drawn between capitalism and racial identity. Could you elaborate on his use of racial capitalism and how you see it manifesting in the world today?
Yes, I can. But first, I just want to shout out all the students that are here and all of the community members as well that have joined us. Thank you so much. I know my parents are also on this call, and I just want to say hello and thank you. And thank you to Max as well for his comments. And I wanted to invite you all in a little bit of a different way that I've sort of taken on, as I'm asked to speak a lot. And I want to just acknowledge the ways in which all of these thoughts that I offer here are only as good as my shared agreements and connections to community. And so in that spirit, I wanted to share with you what I call and have learned from community members to do something called a community board. So I put in the chat a Google Doc that you can open, and I put some resources there, but I've also enabled editing access for everyone. So you can share things there, but you can also share things in the chat. And I hope that it was okay if we started well, first let me start by acknowledging the Chumash lands that I'm speaking from in Ventura, California. And I want to pay my respects to these elders past, present, and emerging. And I also want to ask, if I could, for everyone in community maybe answer this question that's at the top of the Google Doc in the chat, not in the Google Doc, but in the chat. What makes you feel truly free? That's what I would like to start with. What makes you feel truly free? And I will say, maybe just to start, one of the things that makes me feel truly free is to hear my daughter laughing, dancing, inner peace, being in community. A lot of dancing, music, sleeping. Yes, I know, me too. Climbing trees, how nice. Oh, look at that. Walking in nature. Yes, your future secure in God. Thank you. Being able to move freely. Yes, thank you. Playing with your dog and being a kid again. I like that. Me too. The joy of connecting with others. Watching the sunrise. Beautiful. Writing what you feel. How nice. Being carefree. Being outdoors. Being able to focus on what you enjoy. Open water. Yes, thank you. A hug to your daughter. Sound nice. Doing cardio. Okay. Poetry. How nice. If anybody else wants to add? Finishing all homework. I heard that. Being able to be yourself. Good for you. Do that. Fixing that elusive bug in the program. Art making. Beautiful. I want to acknowledge all of these. And I want to thank you all for sharing them, because really, if releasing yourself to the mystery. How nice, Melissa. Thank you for that language. Really, if we're thinking about what we're doing here together, there's so much tradition in the academy of the expert downloading, right? It's something that I have to say, like, I find very useful in many, many arenas, but also I am, questioning a lot about the direction that the academy is going in, but also I am trusting in the direction that community knowledge brings me. So I wanted to just start there. And I would also just like to then go ahead and answer your question, Michael. Thank you. So, your question is to ensure we build the foundation for listeners and to elaborate on the use of Cedric Robinson's use of the term racial capitalism. That's right? Yeah. So one of the things that Cedric, who I've known most of my life, I had known before we lost him. One of the things that he points out in Black Marxism is that Marxism fails to account for the racial character of capitalism. And he began thinking about this well before he wrote his dissertation, but also in an active sense as he wrote Black Marxism while he was in conversation with people who were fighting apartheid in South Africa. And he heard the term racial capitalism and then began to think about the way that it could be used to talk about an entire system that people all over the world were subject to, and not just one that had existed in South Africa. And so in the history of political economy, a lot of people think of capitalism as this thing that comes after feudalism. And not only as the thing that comes after feudalism, but also as a revolutionary moment when white men rejected feudalism as like this old world system. So again, just explaining this to folks who might be new to the term. My friend and colleague, Robin D.G. Kelley, wrote this really beautiful and very succinct summary of what Cedric Robinson was talking about when he used the term racial capitalism. And I put the link in the community board a little bit further down the page. But he talks about how capitalism evolved from feudalism to produce a modern world system of racial capitalism that was premised on slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide. And I would say premised and always dependent on those mechanisms of white supremacy. And Cedric points out that capitalism is racial because the feudal society that it springs from is already full of racialism. And he makes the point in incredible detail about the ways that white Europeans were already racializing people in Europe. We see the emergence of a working class that is racialized: Irish folks, Jewish folks, gypsies. So before we even begin to talk about the US or Canada and slavery and genocide, capitalism is already based on the subjugation of racial subjects in European domination over Europeans. And so this is a kind of like a little historical overview of the term. So today, where do we see this? We see this in the commodification of people of color, the trade in BIPOC bodies to preserve white authority. We see this literally and figuratively. We see this in the ways that people of color are overrepresented in media and underrepresented in education. We see it in the systems that presume white authority, both mental and moral. We see it in orchestrated economic crises like houselessness and displacement. We see it in the privatization of what should be public, in community spaces, schools, national parks. We see it in the denigration of tribal lands and sovereignty. We see it in land grabs, both urban and non-urban, and especially in mass incarceration and deportation. We see racial capitalism manifest in awful racist rhetoric, increasing frequency of violent attacks against trans, Black, Latinx, Indigenous folks, and then they guarantee that no charges are brought against the perpetrators of state-sanctioned extrajudicial murders by police of innocent people of color. So I think that's what he meant and where we see it today.
Thanks so much for both the way you started, and it made me step back and take a breath as well, but also for setting up a foundation for us to continue the conversation.
Sure.
So just for everyone else in the room, I want to kind of talk about the futures of Black radicalism a little bit, to encourage readers to go to it, because it's a series of essays which which I love because you don't have to read a whole book. You can just
Yes.
go essay by essay. And it brings together like so many amazing thinkers and thoughts in the way it breaks up the book into racial capitalism, into Black radical tradition, but then in the futures of Black radicalism, and like thinking like Afrofuturistically about the future. So again, to build a little bit more on that foundation, Black radical tradition, it's I'm sure many people have heard the word, especially through the uprisings of last summer in the wake of George Floyd's death and killing. And it's been immensely influential in social movements, including Black Lives Matter, more closer to home, but also in social movements across the globe, and continues to inspire a new generation of thinkers and activists. The Black radical tradition is not only a resistance to oppression, but it's also an ontology. So could you share with us how you think of the Black radical tradition and why it's so important for liberation movements today?
Yes, absolutely. So for those people who, like me, did not know the meaning of ontology until I was well into grad school, just so you know, it is like shared beliefs. It's a way of being, a way of knowing. There's these fancy words, epistemology and ontology, ways of being and ways of knowing. So the Black radical tradition is, really the beauty for me in Cedric Robinson's work, and also in the ways that his work lives on in so many different people's work, and the way that he was inspired, and the way that so many of our intellectual heroes and our movement heroes are inspired by Black people and what Black people have done to stay getting free and to stay nourished and to stay safe and to stay joyful. So this is a tradition of resistance, of renewal, of regeneration that existed not just in response to the violence of racial capitalism, but also before it. And I think that's really important to delineate, because a lot of times we think about Black resistance as something that is always in response to some kind of white violence and authority, when in fact, Robinson locates resistance in this Black tradition as something that existed before capitalism. In fact, in secular realms and secular areas, it's if anything honed by 5 centuries of genocide, of chattel slavery, of wars of propaganda meant to destroy Black people. It's honed by dispossession, by displacement, by banishment. It's honed by all of these things, the mass incarceration, surveillance regimes. But it's most importantly an enduring vision of a shared future. And that shared future is this radical imagination of an unshakable belief in the possibility of abolition of all forms of oppression. This is the Black radical tradition, and how it manifests is in so many ways, is in myriad ways. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you for setting that foundation for us. And again, as Max and I spoke about as well, this work is so bound up in history, but it's also used to articulate the importance of imagination. So what is that imaginative work of the Black radical tradition to create liberatory futures?
Thank you. This is the creation of new politics, of new kinds of art and expression out of terrible realities, the continuation of a tradition that has sustained Black people for centuries, despite the effort to destroy us, as James Baldwin called it, root and branch. So this is the convening of joy, of stunning, singular, diverse cultural possibilities. It's the stubbornness to hold on to love as an organizing principle. It's a belief in the regeneration of stories and one's own spirit as a weapon against white supremacy. And you find it everywhere. You find it in, and I have it on the community board, murals of Black trans lives. We find it in the way that people have spontaneous concerts in the middle of protests, in the ways that the unseen labor of mothers to free their children from mass incarceration happens all over the world in the vigils, silent and loud, that people um, stand and sit in compassion on streets, corners, or in closets with candles. We find it in so many different places, but again, rooted in this imagination that is created in spite of, that is created in beauty and in a recognition that none of that kind of work can be done in isolation, but that it only lives in community.
Thank you. Yeah, love as an organizing principle, and in that community, we can start to build a new world. I really appreciate that. Mm-hmm. So, I read your book, Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, and I loved it. And what I thought was really interesting is I may have missed it, but I didn't hear this reference to Black radical tradition through it, but it clearly was an expression of that through the whole book as well. And in the book, you share the historical solidarity work between Black and Brown folks in social movements, but also in cultural and artistic expression. So just to quote a piece of that book, the articulation of spatial entitlements, maybe we can unpack that word a little bit after this. The articulation of spatial entitlements by cultural workers, activists, and ordinary people flow from the knowledge that meaningful space is essential for the survival of communities, but also for the discursive practices encoding the stories that define and redefine who people are, where they fit into the world, and what they envision for the future. So before moving on to the question, maybe we could just talk a little bit about spatial entitlements and how you come to formulate that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I'm really glad you asked that question, because it allows me the opportunity to talk about what I would do differently now. I wrote this, and a lot of people have quoted this phrase, spatial entitlement, and I'm so humbled by that, how it's caught on, because a lot of people saw themselves in that rendering around community and taking space, that and that it felt empowering to them, and so that makes it feel empowering to me. But I also, in that rendering of space, I'm still evolving, and so I would now, I think if I was to write the book again, I would now acknowledge that any space that is taken up by Black and Brown people is done on lands that were taken from Indigenous people. And I would much more concretely link the struggles of Black and Brown freedom seekers to both the history of racial violence, of colonialism and dispossession, but also to the traditions of resistance that we refer to as Black radical traditions, but also have been, Indigenous traditions as well. So I'm glad that you asked that, because this is something I try to say often now. What I meant when I coined that phrase, I still mean today, which is that there are all these ways that we in our lives, in our communities, are stripped of assets. And this is something that my friend and colleague Clyde Woods talked a lot about, was asset stripping. In fact, he gave me this painting behind me here on his last trip to Haiti. He talked about this and about the ways in which, as a collective, we're unable to get ahead, let alone imagine ourselves as a meaningful part of any kind of economy that it was, orchestrated under capitalism. And so how do we then kind of assert our humanity on different kinds of landscapes? And I was talking about a particular landscape in Los Angeles, in the city of Los Angeles, but it was meant to apply to pretty much every city. And that is like, what are especially the cultural expressions and the freedom movements that Black and Brown people have engaged in, both together, which I think is really important, because the narrative around Black and Brown a coalition is really actually one of division, but also what are the ways that we learn from each other's struggles how do we take up space, whether it is sonic space through, traveling in cars, through radio technology that announces who we are before we get there, through shared soundtracks of life. And we see this in the influence of blues and jump blues on people like Richie Valens, the influence of Chuck Berry on so many Latinx musicians, the importance of R&B for the assimilation of Latinx Spanish-speaking people into U.S. society in particular. The way that they become Americans is through Black music a lot of times. And so how we share these soundtracks, but then also how we use our bodies and our cultural expressions to take up space when assets are not only not assured, but revoked. And we see the largest loss of assets in history after the recession in the early 2000s. And so this is an ongoing crisis. We see it now as well. So I guess that's what I would say I meant by this this sense of entitlement that is articulated in ways that don't always translate to monetary asset accumulation, but instead articulate the ways in which we are always human and continuing to evolve in that way.
Yeah, thank you for elaborating on that a little bit. And it made me think about these in where I live in Vancouver. Last year there was a big movement around protesting a pipeline that was going through some unceded Indigenous territories, and there were occupations of numerous ports in Vancouver as a form of spatial entitlement. And the solidarities and the joy that were experienced in those places were just so profound and so powerful. Like the education in those spaces can feel a lot more powerful than the education that comes in other spaces.
Oh yes, and much more meaningful, much more. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So moving on to one question here around that book, I guess tying in both spatial entitlement, but also the Black radical tradition. These meaningful spaces are spaces of struggle, but also of joy, kinship, love, and community building. And they're articulated throughout your entire book. So how do you see, and maybe building on root and branch, how do you see community building, joy, and conviviality as part of the Black radical tradition?
I mean, it's what constitutes it. It's so important. And part of the reason it's important is because capitalism, we feel so sort of obviously contained by it. We feel so determined by it, over-determined by it. We feel like we swim in it all the time. We do, but it also cannot be the last word. And I think that's the thing about the Black radical tradition, and also so many traditions of people of color who are always struggling against and within it, but who also have the courage to envision something different, who have the courage, Black people, to say, if that means that we do not give 40 acres and a mule because we need to acknowledge land back, then that means we want to be in conversation about that. We want to figure out what it is that we owe, but also what we want to, who we want to help and who we want to be in struggle with. These are all beautiful parts of what Black struggle, what struggle in solidarity means. And so when we think about the convening and of joy, we think about convivencia, we think about community building. In many respects, it's the only way. I mean, it's only in white institutions really that we learn somehow that we are the makers of our own present and future. We're never the only makers of our own present or future. And this is a lie. It's a myth that is perpetrated over and over again, not just to keep people out, but also to get people to believe that they never had a past and they don't have a future without that kind of belief. And so when we refuse that and we understand that all of our most radical ideas happen in community, that the nourishment that we need to sustain ourselves through these violent times comes from constant mutuality that comes from acknowledging what other people who are unsung, who are unknown, often making history, not making history books, as my friend George Lipsitz often says. These are the folks whose stories that we need to know, that we don't need to be transactional about, or that we don't need to commodify, but that we need to know, that we need to like chew on like gum, you know, so that we understand that we are not the center of it, and that capitalism is not the last word, but indeed we together are the ones who keep the dialogue going, not about what is ultimate, what is final, and or even who wins, but necessarily how we are in community with one another. I mentioned Clyde Woods earlier, and he used to say, you know, we got to be more than academic coroners. We can't just be people who are like describing trauma all the time. We have to also think about all of the ways that we have come together and will continue to be in radical compassion and community with one another. And I want to just also mention one last thing, which is something that George Lipsitz talks about in his revised and expanded edition of The Possessive Investment in Whiteness. He talks about this climate being one of recreational hate. And as a like the political sphere is one in which people love to engage in recreational hate. Even the people that we look up to and love and admire, still all of a sudden it's become a climate in which it's chic to put people down. You know, we see this on Twitter all the time. So, you know, how do we disengage from that? Well, the way you do that is you re-engage with our community practices. That's not something that we made up. You know, we are people who have the anecdote to that, and we have to believe in ourselves. We have to return to trusting our intuition about what is whole and good. And that requires reflection, that requires a different kind of time, which is what Damien Sojourner talks about in Futures of Black Radicalism. It requires a disinvestment from this kind of practice of recreational hate. It requires the courage to imagine something different. And you can only do that together.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so much to share in that. I really appreciate, Gaye, the last 25 minutes chatting with you. And I'm excited to keep that conversation going a little bit with Max. I did create 4 questions, but that wouldn't do justice to the audience in making sure that they have a few of their questions answered. So we'll see where we get. I might just ask 1 or 2 of these. So Krista, if you're there, if you want to throw, bring Max, thank you. Okay. Welcome, Max, again.
Thank you. And thank you, Gaye, for those amazing insights.
Okay. So in a few of our previous events, there's been a number of themes that have come up, and especially in our last one around hidden histories, and then one last semester on mutual aid and transformative justice. We've spoken a lot about the way capitalism encloses, alienates, and isolates people from each other, but also the way it commodifies care, and could even toxify our relationships in a lot of ways. And capitalism can also feel like the enclosure of imagination. So I would love to hear from both of you. Maybe, Max, we can start with you. In the way you think capitalism limits or impedes our imagination currently.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to maybe start by just echoing the brilliant point that Gaye pointed out, that like, as we have this conversation, let's just keep in mind that capitalism is a parasitical layer over top of the beauty of life. I mean, and it's so easy for us to fall prey to the idea that it's this kind of complete system that we can never escape from. But actually everything that's really meaningful about our lives, from our relationships to our friendships to all of those ways that folks spoke about freedom, these things don't exist. They exist under the conditions of capitalism, but they're not created by capitalism. So I just really want to echo that point, while at the same time acknowledging that what this system has been so good at, and it's so difficult is that unlike so many other systems of domination, capitalism offers us or tells us that it offers us the means to fulfill our dreams. And so often when you ask people, what their dreams are, they begin by speaking about something that's very heartfelt and very honest, and then very quickly our imaginations turn to what we imagine to be pragmatic, which is like, okay, how are we actually going to get there? Like, okay, you want to live in a house in the country, maybe, or maybe you want to be a musician and give your gifts through music, or you want to be a teacher. And very quickly, we're always encouraged, and probably many of the students here have the experience that they're encouraged by their families to be like, well, how are you going to make that pay the bills? And I think there's such a dangerous thing about that, because capitalism as a system is able to convince us, or convince many of us, or at least tries to seduce us into thinking that through it, we can achieve the goals of social justice, that through trying to change the system from inside, we're going to change the system and make things better. And I think that's so unfortunate, because it doesn't realize that we're already inside the system, and the system's inside us, and that this is a process of collective transformation, as Gaye was talking about. It draws on these traditions of struggle and solidarity and conviviality that are what we're made of. And so I suppose I just want to underline this point that at many points in all of our lives, capitalism and its institutions will make its siren call. It will make more siren calls to those of us who are born into various forms of what we call privilege. But it will make a siren call to everyone to say that whatever you truly want and value in this world can be provided by, and can be best provided by, participating within the capital system. And that includes our desires and dreams for justice. And the only way we can save ourselves from that, I think it's impossible for us as individuals to outsmart capitalism. It's not like if you study it or you learn about it, you can escape its grip. The only way we can avoid that conscription of our imagination towards capitalism's reproduction is by building those links of sometimes difficult solidarity, and drawing on those traditions of solidarity that keep us honest with each other and keep our eyes fixated on this project of collective liberation.
Thanks, Max. Gaye, do you want me to repeat the question again?
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay. So in our previous events, we've spoken about the way capitalism encloses, alienates, and isolates people from each other, but also the way that it commodifies care and even our relationships. So capitalism can also feel a little bit like the enclosure of our imagination in its seductive abilities, as Max has shared. Can you share the ways in which you think capitalism limits or impedes imagination, and how we think outside of the framing that can be fed to us sometimes?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for repeating that. Yes to all that Max just said. Thank you for that. I'm so inspired by reproductive justice workers, because they are folks who, you talk about working within capitalism, within patriarchy, within heteropatriarchy, underneath sexual violence, all of those different things. And yet they believe that it is possible and it should be necessary for people to have something as simple as birth control. Like just as simple as like be able to find a condom somewhere, to say that it's okay that you don't want to have a baby, or say it's okay that you want to have a baby. So the ways that we think outside of it, I think, or the ways that we can imagine ourselves as being somehow different in it, is certainly, I think you're right, Max, we have to work with what we have. But it's incredible what we're able to imagine without the resources that elite people have. This is what's been so interesting to me. In the last year, I've been doing some consulting for an elite boarding school. And I'd never been to a boarding school before, and I had never encountered that group of folks that are at that level of wealth. I never knew. And education is the place where it happens. That's where it's perpetuated, wealth and exclusivity and all that is perpetuated in the educational system. And what was my biggest takeaway, which is along the same lines of what I was talking about with the RJ workers, is that we who are dreaming about freedom have done such a stellar job without even actually knowing what it looks like. All right, it's like we never even experienced it. Imagine people who were enslaved in like 1701, right? Deciding to leave slavery, not even knowing which way to go, right? And not even knowing like what it would look like to be free, and yet saying freedom. That's what we want. We want freedom. Or people in 1870 saying, or 1865 saying, I don't know what it's like to vote, but yeah, we're gonna need that 15th Amendment. Like, we're gonna need it to mean all these things. We're gonna need it to be abolition and nothing less. It's got to be more than nominal freedom. So I feel like thinking about it and sort of trying to think outside of it is really thinking also in temporal terms, like ahead of it as well. We're always having to we got to be so smart to outsmart whatever it's going to do next. So fundamentally, what that means to me is returning to trusting the intuition of ourselves and our communities about where we can go and about the conversations that we can have together about freedom. Because I think that's one of the number one tricks that like abusive systems play on you, is to teach you not to trust yourself. And yet we can trust ourselves, because when you do see freedom and you do see safety and you see societies free of surveillance and all of that, you realize we've been dreaming this stuff. We've been the architects of this stuff. In fact, they got a lot of those ideas from us because we've been demanding them for so long. So I guess that's how I would answer. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. It feels so natural to be in community so often, to be amongst friends and family, chosen or blood related, and the freedom it feels in those moments. So this is gonna be my last question, because I do want to get to some audience questions, and I want to talk a little bit about punishment and justice, because it feels really important in this moment. And I guess, so my question is, the way policing and prisons currently limit the way we imagine what justice is and what justice can be or could be. I think about Miriam Kaba often talking about how when something horrible happens, we think of the worst possible thing that could happen, that could be justice, and it's it's like life imprisonment. It's that's the worst thing we can imagine, like putting them in this little box, isolated completely. And then we see lots of calls for justice and calls for accountability. So what is the work of imagination in imagining justice not as what it is, but in what it could be? And Gaye, could we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. I've learned so much from the cultural convening methodologies of artists who are activists in Boyle Heights and East LA in particular. Some of the people that I do restorative and transformative justice work with, people like Quetzal Flores and Omar Ramirez, Claudia Alec, Alison de la Cruz, people who are in theater, who are musicians, who have taught me how to convene cultural processes, and that to do so is to create the conditions that we need to not just survive, but to imagine a completely new future. And so that means that the answers are already always happening. When I was invited, and it was such a transformative experience. They've been doing it forever, but I got to be this like new, like rookie person doing this thing at the self-help graphics and just downtown near Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. And we had community members, we had folks from all different walks of life. We had all kinds of, but we wrote a song together, and it took us like 3 hours to write the song together. It was incredibly awkward because like none of us really were songwriters except for the musicians who were in the room. But we also curated an exhibit to go with the moment. And when we were done with that song, which was really about justice, about freedom, it was such a beautiful experience because as awkward as it was, as kind of arduous as it was, sometimes it was boring, sometimes it was funny. We created something, but when we left as a community that had done this thing. And these are the processes. I think this is one example of millions of the ways that people create community. And in answer to your question, I think this is the way that we do it. For me, through art, it seems to manifest most visibly. But I think through any kind of convening like that, these things can happen.
Thanks, Gaye. And Max, I'll just repeat the question again. So in thinking about punishment and the way policing in prisons limits how we imagine what justice is and what justice can be, how do you think about ways that support us in imagining new futures beyond like the carceral institution as it is?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're in a truly phenomenal moment when we are beginning to reclaim our powers that have been stolen from us over many generations, to be creatures of community with one another, to take responsibility for being human, or to be human as a praxis, to paraphrase Sylvia Wynter, to recognize the incredible potential we have to transform ourselves and to transform one another. And that the systems that we've been sold as necessary, and the myths we've been sold that make those systems necessary, are coming apart in this moment in ways that are incredible to behold. The idea that we are an inherently competitive species that need to be protected from one another, so that we can eat, and that the only way that we can live together is through the domination of markets and through these logics of racial oppression. I mean, that is all beginning to fall apart thanks to incredible struggles in our moment. I think on the one hand, we're in that moment where we can finally say, and many people have been saying it for many generations, but finally we can say with an increasingly unified and loud voice that in fact the prison and police are unnecessary institutions, and not only unnecessary, but also dangerous and enforcing of a system of domination and pain. And yet we're also at a moment when we are forced to pick up many of the ruins of other systems that we have practiced in many different forms around the world that have been stolen or repressed over the years. And what it's meant, I think, is that there's still, to paraphrase Marian Kaba, whom you mentioned, there's a fumbling towards repair. These systems that we're working with, we're still relearning them. We're exercising muscles that we haven't been able to exercise. And I think that just means that we need to be very patient with ourselves and patient with one another, and recognize that even though we are beginning to develop tools for transformative justice that allow us to move around the reliance on policing and prisons, those tools they're not in their infancy because they've been used for many generations in many cases, but they are fragile things. They're fragile things that require a lot of care and a lot of thought and a lot of compassion. I suppose in some way, I think about us coming out of this moment as brokenhearted, that somehow we need to make a pathway together out of the incredible violence that has brought us to this place. And if we are a revolution of the brokenhearted, then we need to begin from a place of recognizing that our wholeness and our ability to work together is something that we build, and we build in one another, rather than something that we come to the table with already. And that healing those hearts and healing our communities might take generations. So we need to be patient and maybe recognize that it's not a sprint, it's a long distance run that'll take most of us the rest of our lives, and maybe several more generations after that too.
I just want to say amen to that, because that is what is often repeated in restorative and transformative healing circles, is trust the process. Trust the process. And we convene that process again and again. We reimagine it, we begin again, we stop, we have these awkward, beginnings, we have these struggles to coalition, but we trust the process. And that's always so important. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, Matt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Max, and thank you, Gaye, so much. I want to invite Sydney forward. We'll have time for one question. It's a really good one, so thank you for the person who submitted that. Sydney, if you want to join us and share the question that's been asked.
Yeah, so I'm going to paste it in the chat briefly as I'm reading it out loud. So the question is, I tend to think that meritocracy has been a silent, widespread, and powerful force perpetuating capitalism, especially in societies driven by white supremacy. Thoughts? And I'll paste that into the chat for reference. So Gaye, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts to this proposition?
Around meritocracy, yes. Oh my goodness, I have so many thoughts about this. Is a great question. Let me tell you what really I thought was incredibly ironic, being at UCLA right as the pandemic began, how quickly the bottom line emerged. And I say this because here obviously in the US, the SAT and the PSAT and all of these standardized tests that were required, that we have been saying for so long, are not good measurements of our intelligence, are truly trash, right? And are gatekeepers, but yet perpetuate this thing over and over again around like how, whether you deserve to be admitted into an institution of higher learning. And yet when the pandemic began, what's the first thing that went? Standardized tests. No longer a requirement to get into UCLA, right? It's just with just a swipe of a pen, that was it, over. And so obviously it's somewhat affirming, and then it's also a little bit ironic given that so many people were indicted last year in the US for cheating for their kids on these standardized tests. But it's affirming in the sense that like we always knew that, right? And we kind of want to scream that at these admissions boards. It's like it was never about whether we deserved it, whether we had earned it. We have earned it. We have different kinds of knowledges. It's kind of like what you were talking about earlier, Michael. It's like what are the knowledges and experiences that we gain in our communities, but also like what have we done with we've done so much with so little. So much with so little, and yet the things that measure us and say whether or not we deserve to have these doors opened or these things bestowed upon us, all those measurements are created by people in power. So for those people, for anybody, if you're asking this and you're a student, just remember that that the people who hold the power around these questions of admitting you into things or conferring upon you a degree, giving you a job, telling you that you're deserving, telling you that your work and your labor and your imagination matter. Those are not often us, our people that understand our struggles and our histories and our contributions. So back to this question of like trusting your intuition and the knowledge of your community, always come back to that, always. And yes, you're right about the meritocracy stuff.
Thank you for those insights. I appreciate the reminder to always go back to to your community, to your practices, to the things that make you whole and not the things that are required or expected of you under certain systems. So thank you so much for providing those insights. So Mac's second question, and I just want to give a shout out to the question asker, Stefano, who's in the room with us currently. So the question was, I tend to think about that meritocracy has been a silent, widespread, and powerful force perpetuating capitalism, especially in societies driven by white supremacy. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Thank you, Stefano, and thank you to Sydney for relating it. And yeah, I just really want to echo Gaye that like these notions of merit are socially constructed, and those who have the power get to socially construct them. Like we shouldn't believe like the aristocracy of the European feudalism, or the patrician class of ancient Rome, or any other imperialist warlords we care to imagine from history have always imagined themselves to be the most meritorious people. And they create the conditions where they can prove it to themselves. They deny the people under them access to all of the things that they think make a person's life worth living, and that make a person refined or make a person meritorious. And then they use the conditions they themselves have created in order to justify the power that they use to create those conditions. And I think there's very little different within a capitalist economy, with the exception that, unlike many other systems, unfortunately, many of the members of the ruling class of capitalism don't even realize they're members of the ruling class. They've bought into their own ideology to such an extent that they believe that they have been, that they've risen to the top through this meritocratic process, and that the reason that they're rich and powerful is because of merit, rather than because of inherited wealth, which is usually the case, or because they've been very good servants to the system of capitalism that has enriched them at the expense of so many others. So I think that might be the first thing I would say about merit. And the other thing I would say about it, though, is like, I think the wonderful thing about the abolitionist questions that we've been working with today and we've learned so much from is that they tell us, it's not enough to just abolish the system. We also need to start building now the systems that will replace it. And I think we could say the same thing about merit. The system of merit has been created and it needs to be destroyed, and we need to stop believing in it. But what do we want to believe in? And how do we want to honor those people in our communities who are the long distance runners, who are the long-term fighters, who are the caregivers, the people who have the knowledge, the people who can pass on the knowledge? What are the criteria by which we want to honor people? What are the criteria by which we want to value people and recognize that when we come to the table, well, we are all fundamentally equal in our right to live and enjoy the fruits of our time together on the planet, that we do bring different things to the table. And I think if we want to get rid of merit, which we should do, we should also think about those forms of honoring and really take it seriously. Because like with abolition, if we want to abolish the criminal justice system as it exists and take responsibility for creating forms of transformative and restorative justice, that is a huge responsibility we take on, not one to be taken on lightly. And likewise, if we're going to abolish all those forms of hierarchy and merit-based and, the honors that we have in this corrupt society, then we also need to take responsibility for recreating what it is we want to see.
Thank you for that insight as well. And I feel like there's a really strong connection between the pieces you were discussing in answering that question. What are the criteria that we take up instead of merit? The answer could be returning to those community practices and returning to our community knowledge. So thank you so much for your insights and for answering this lovely question. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Michael. Thank you both for everything tonight.
Just echoing the gratitude for Sydney, for Gaye, and for Max. Thank you so much for sharing this brief 90 minutes with us. Far too brief. And I want to value your own time to make sure we wrap up the event, though. And so many great challenges there. And Max just sharing, how do you decide how do we decide how to honor and value people, and gain, like, returning to our intuition, returning to our community, such valuable practices that I hope the students who are here and who will watch the recording take and hold with them as well. Just before we wrap up, this is the final event of the series. Thank you to all of those who've tuned in over the last 3 months now. And I really want to ask that you fill out this survey. It's really important for us because it actually helps us decide what kind of programming you're interested in as students in the future. So it'll take you 20 to 30 seconds to fill it out. And thank you to everyone who's showed up, who's joined the chat, who's listened, who will be listening. You're all appreciated. And I hope you all have a good night.
Thank you to everyone. And Max, oh my goodness, it's great to be in conversation with you and your brilliant work. Thank you so much for it.
Thank you so much.
You
it's been an
both
honor.
Yeah, same here. And thank you all to everybody who organized this and to everybody who came.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yay.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, and big shout out to the Johnsons, is it? To your mother and father?
Yeah, there they are.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Gaye and Max. I'll be in touch via email shortly.
Okay.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Good night.